Act 1. The Dream and the Chains, 1776. The summer air in Philadelphia was thick with heat and history. Horses snorted in the narrow cobblestone streets, their hooves clicking like the ticking of a clock, counting down to a nation's birth. Inside the State House, men in powdered wigs and linen coats argued, shouted, and dreamed aloud about liberty. The words they were crafting were dangerous, words meant to defy a king, to carve independence out of empire. Thomas Jefferson sat hunched over his desk, quill in hand, his fingers stained with ink. He paused before writing the words that would echo through centuries. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. But just beyond his window, the air carried a different sound, the dull clatter of chains, the cry of a woman calling to her child from the quarters behind his grand home in Virginia. Her name was Dinah, and she would never hear those words read aloud. Jefferson's pen trembled slightly, but he kept writing. Across the colonies, drums of revolution rolled. In taverns, men raised their mugs to freedom. In fields, enslaved men bent their backs beneath the same July sun, listening to whispers that something was changing. They had no seats in Congress, no votes, no voices, but hope traveled even faster than rumor. In Virginia, a young man named Josiah, 20 years old, born into bondage, watched his master's sons practice drills with muskets. "They're fighting for freedom," one whispered. Josiah looked at the rifle, then at his own calloused hands. Freedom, he thought, was a word that could feed you or burn you, depending on who spoke it. The colonies roared against Britain's tyranny, but in the shadows, their own tyranny endured. In South Carolina, enslaved Africans built forts and raised crops that financed the revolution. In Massachusetts, some were already breaking free, men like Peter Salem, who would soon stand on the battlefield at Bunker Hill and fire his musket, not just for a nation's freedom, but for his own. The contradiction was too large to ignore, yet too profitable to confront. Liberty and slavery shared the same cradle. When the Declaration was read aloud in the public square, the crowd erupted with cheers. Bells rang across Philadelphia. Jefferson stood among his peers, the words echoing proudly, "All men are created equal." But in the southern fields, Dinah rocked her baby to sleep beneath a roof of rough timber. The baby's name was Samuel. He would grow up hearing stories of liberty he would never taste. The revolution had begun, bullets, blood, and banners of freedom. But beneath every cry for independence lay an unspoken truth. The new America was being born with a double soul. In taverns, patriots toasted to liberty or death. In the quarters, enslaved people whispered prayers to the same God, asking if he heard them too. Some believed he did. Others had stopped believing long ago. George Washington took command of the Continental Army. On the hills of Boston, he looked across the sea toward the British ships and saw not just an enemy, but a question. Could a nation built on bondage truly call itself free? Yet even Washington owned men who would follow him into battle. Among them was William Lee, his enslaved valet, who would ride at his side through the storms of war. The dream of freedom was vast, but its borders were drawn by race. That winter, snow fell across the colonies, covering battlefields and plantations alike. Jefferson's words spread like wildfire across Europe and the Americas, stirring philosophers and peasants alike. But within America, those words were shackled by compromise and fear. In Virginia, Josiah listened to an old preacher who said, "God is writing a new chapter in the world." Josiah smiled faintly and whispered, then let him write me free. Far away, in the candlelit rooms of Philadelphia, the Founding Fathers signed the Declaration. They believed they were creating something eternal, a republic of equality and justice. But as the ink dried, the ink itself became a betrayal. Because in that moment, the men who declared liberty for all had already decided who all truly meant. The cheers that followed were not universal. They were selective. They were conditional. And yet, the story was not only of hypocrisy, but of hope born in pain. For every chain, there was a heart still beating with faith. For every injustice, there was resistance forming quietly beneath the surface. From the rice fields of the Carolinas to the icy docks of Boston, from enslaved mothers whispering to their children to free blacks joining militias, there was a collective understanding. The war might be about white men's freedom, but the meaning of freedom itself was much larger. It was being redefined by those who had never tasted it. The dream of America had been spoken into existence. The chains were still there, but now they rattled louder.
The war that began in the name of liberty soon swept across every colony like a storm that could not tell friend from foe. Muskets thundered in the forests of New England, cannons shook the coastlines, and the air filled with the smell of smoke, sweat, and new beginnings, though not for everyone. Freedom had become a slogan, but for thousands of black men and women, it was a question whispered into the wind. Who will liberty belong to when the guns fall silent? In the winter of 1777, the Continental Army camped at Valley Forge. The soldiers were barefoot, hungry, and bleeding into the snow. Among them were men whose names never appeared in the records. Freedmen, runaways, and slaves promised emancipation in exchange for service. They built the same fires, froze under the same moon, and fought beneath the same flag as men who might have once owned them. One such man was Joseph Plum, born into slavery in Connecticut, but freed when he enlisted. He marched with Washington's men, carrying a musket almost as tall as himself. He wrote in his small Bible every night, "We fight for a freedom that still doubts we deserve it." He was right. Across the ocean, King George's officers saw an opportunity. The British governor of Virginia, Lord Dunmore, issued a proclamation. All slaves who join His Majesty's forces shall be free. The promise cut through the colonies like lightning. Thousands fled the plantations to join the British lines, risking death for a chance at dignity. In the chaos of war, the enslaved made their own revolution. Some called them traitors. History would later call them visionaries. Meanwhile, in the halls of the Continental Congress, fear and necessity locked arms. The delegates spoke of freedom by day and counted the enslaved by night, because their wealth, their farms, and their political power were bound to those they kept in bondage. Jefferson wrote fiery words about tyranny, while his own slaves tended to his estate. George Washington's moral conflict deepened. He no longer believed slavery was just, yet he couldn't see how to end it without tearing apart the fragile cause of independence. Freedom was the prize, but hypocrisy was the price. The war spread southward. In the Carolinas, plantation fields became battlegrounds. Enslaved men fought with whoever offered them the greater promise of freedom. On one side, the red-coated British soldiers sang of monarchy and deliverance. On the other, ragged Americans shouted for liberty while guarding the slave quarters at night. A mother named Dinah, whose child Samuel had grown since 1776, heard the distant cannons and prayed they were shaking the world in her favor. But she knew better. When soldiers passed through her master's fields, she saw the same greed in both armies' eyes. War had no color of mercy. By 1781, the Revolution reached its turning point at Yorktown. The fields of Virginia shook as gunfire tore the air apart. Among the chaos was a regiment of black soldiers fighting beneath the American flag. They fought not for pay, not for politics, but for a word that yet didn't include them: freedom. When the smoke cleared and the British surrendered, the band played triumphantly. Men cheered, hugged, and cried. Joseph Plum dropped to his knees, exhausted, whispering, "Maybe now we are all free." But even as the cannons fell silent, the chains did not. The Treaty of Paris in 1783 declared independence. The colonies were now the United States of America. Bells rang again in Philadelphia, and the people rejoiced. Yet the war had only changed one form of bondage for another. While white America broke free from a king, hundreds of thousands of black Americans remained enslaved under men who now called themselves founders. Some enslaved people who had joined the British fled to Canada, to Sierra Leone, to new lives carved from the ruins of empire. Others were captured, sold again, or betrayed by empty promises. The revolution had set fire to the world, but its light fell unevenly. And beneath the celebration, the Founding Fathers faced an unbearable question: how to unite a nation built on two opposing truths, liberty and slavery. The war had revealed it brutally. The North was beginning to turn against slavery, while the South had doubled down, their economy now more dependent than ever on human labor. The dream of freedom had been won at musket point, but its moral debt was still unpaid. Washington returned to Mount Vernon. He stood on his porch watching the sunset over the Potomac. The land was peaceful again, but on that land, dozens of enslaved people still worked from dawn till night. He said nothing, but the silence was heavy. He had fought for a free country that was already haunted. Across the nation, whispers of a new meeting spread, one that would decide how this fragile republic should govern itself. The war was over, but the real battle was about to begin. For in the shadows of victory, the same men who declared liberty for all would now decide how much liberty could be compromised to protect their wealth. And thus began the march towards Philadelphia, 1787, towards the Constitutional Convention, where ideals and interests would collide again. The Revolution had freed America from Britain, but it had not freed America from itself.
The war was over. The new nation had survived the impossible. But peace, like victory, revealed the cracks beneath the glory. The colonies, now states, were bound together by a fragile thread. The Articles of Confederation, their first experiment in unity, was collapsing under its own weakness. The currency was unstable, the government powerless, and rebellion brewed in the countryside. In the spring of 1787, delegates gathered in Philadelphia once more. 55 men entered Independence Hall to shape a constitution that would define a nation. The world called them visionaries. History would call them brilliant. But the truth was more complicated. They were also cornered by fear, by ambition, and by the ghosts of the institution they refused to confront. Outside, the streets hummed with life. Vendors shouting, carriages rolling, children chasing dogs through puddles. Inside, the air was heavy with candle smoke and compromise. George Washington, silent and dignified, presided over the hall. Benjamin Franklin, old and weary, sat quietly, his mind sharp as ever. James Madison scribbled notes, every word of debate captured by his restless pen. The great question was not only how to build a republic, but what kind of people that republic would recognize as fully human. On the second week of debate, tempers flared. Delegates from the North argued that representation in Congress should be based on population. Southern delegates agreed until the question arose, would enslaved people count? If they did not, the South would lose political power. If they did, then the South was admitting that the enslaved were people. and that would make slavery itself an abomination against the very principles they had just fought for. It was a moral knot they could neither untie nor cut. James Wilson of Pennsylvania spoke first. His voice echoed in the chamber. "If slaves are property, they cannot be counted as citizens, but if they are men, then let them be free." Silence followed. Then a delegate from South Carolina, Charles Pinckney, rose slowly. His tone was calm, but his words carried steel. "Without counting our Negroes, the South will never accept this union." Franklin sighed deeply. Washington looked down. The word union trembled in the air, fragile, conditional, already stained. Days turned into weeks. The heat grew unbearable. Windows were nailed shut to keep secrets from spilling into the streets. Inside, the men of liberty debated how much of humanity they were willing to ignore for the sake of stability. At night, enslaved servants brought them water, cleaned their rooms, and tended to their horses, silent witnesses to the birth of a nation that still refused to see them. Then came the infamous compromise. For every 5 enslaved people, 3 would count toward a state's population, not for freedom, but for representation in Congress. It was called the 3/5 Compromise, a calculation of humanity, written in ink, embedded in law. The moment the clause was accepted, the Constitution gained the strength it needed to pass and lost the soul it claimed to protect. But the bargains did not stop there. The South demanded protection for the transatlantic slave trade. They wanted 20 years without interference, a window to import human lives freely, unchallenged. Many from the North protested. Gouverneur Morris, his voice trembling with anger, called slavery a nefarious institution, the curse of heaven on the states where it prevailed. Yet again, the room chose silence. Economics triumphed over ethics. In the end, the Constitution would protect property, not people. When the final draft was read aloud, the delegates stood in solemn agreement. They had created something magnificent and monstrous. The preamble began, "We the people," but the people did not include women. It did not include the poor, and it certainly did not include the enslaved. The ink was black, but the shadow it cast was darker still. That night, Franklin returned home through the quiet streets. The city glowed with lamplight. He paused by a tavern, listening to common folk celebrate rumors of a great new government. He smiled faintly, but his eyes were weary. He turned to a young apprentice walking beside him and said, "We have given you a republic, if you can keep it." He did not say what kind of republic or what price it demanded to keep. At Mount Vernon, Washington read the new Constitution by candlelight. The words were orderly, balanced, visionary, yet he could not ignore what was missing. He looked out the window toward the slave quarters below. A single lantern flickered in the dark. He whispered softly, "We have built freedom upon a foundation of chains." And across the South, enslaved people continued their endless labor, unaware that their existence had been debated, quantified, and reduced to fractions by men who spoke of liberty. Dinah's son, Samuel, now 12, worked in the fields from dawn till dusk. The world had changed above him, but his world had not changed at all. Still, there was something new in the air. A restlessness, a whisper carried by travelers and soldiers. A constitution has been made. Samuel looked up at the horizon. He did not know what a constitution was, but he sensed that the men who wrote it had not written his name within it. Thus, America was born again, stronger in government, weaker in conscience. The Constitution united the states, but divided the soul of a nation. It was brilliant, it was flawed, it was unstable by design. The founders had ensured their legacy would endure, but they had also ensured their betrayal would echo. And in those echoes, the next battles were already forming.
The ink of the Constitution had barely dried when the real war began, not with muskets, but with words, with fear, with silence. America had a government now, but not yet a soul. Across the 13 states, the fight shifted from the battlefield to the town halls and newspapers. Men gathered to debate. Should this new Constitution be ratified? Could it truly hold the fragile Union together? And beneath those questions, a darker one lingered unspoken. Can a nation that calls itself free survive while millions remain enslaved? In Boston, pamphlets fluttered through the streets like restless birds. Abolitionists and ministers thundered from pulpits that the Constitution had betrayed the Revolution's promise. In the South, planters toasted the document as divine proof that God Himself sanctioned their way of life. The same parchment inspired hope and despair, depending on which side of the whip one lived. In Philadelphia, free black men like Richard Allen and Absalom Jones founded churches and mutual aid societies. They preached that true liberty could not be partial, that the new republic must one day reckon with its hypocrisy. They spoke softly, because to speak too loudly was dangerous, but their faith burned brighter than fear. Richard Allen wrote in his journal, "The Lord of freedom shall not forever let His name be mocked by the chains of His children." Meanwhile, the Federalists, Washington, Madison, Hamilton, defended the Constitution with relentless energy. They argued it was not perfect, but necessary. The nation needed unity before purity, strength before morality. And so, the moral wound was left open, bandaged with words like later and someday. By 1789, the Constitution was ratified. Washington took the oath as the first president of the United States. The crowd cheered wildly, hats thrown in the air, bells ringing again across Philadelphia. But at Mount Vernon, the celebrations were quieter. Enslaved hands prepared the feast. Enslaved eyes watched from a distance as the man they served became the symbol of freedom itself. Samuel, now a young man, stood by the river that bordered his master's land. The flag of the new United States rippled above the house. He whispered, "That flag don't wave for me." In the years that followed, laws began to shape the republic. Taxes, courts, armies, commerce. The machinery of government turned efficiently, but within its gears, human lives were still being ground down. The Fugitive Slave Laws were strengthened. Northern states began gradual emancipation, while the South doubled its commitment to bondage. The cotton gin would soon appear, multiplying both wealth and misery. The Revolution's promise had become selective prosperity. In Congress, debates about slavery were avoided like disease. It will destroy the Union, some warned. Better to remain silent. That silence became the national language, polite, deliberate, and deadly. And yet the voices of the enslaved and the free black communities grew louder, more organized, more determined. Petitions began to reach the new Congress from Quakers and free African Americans, demanding the abolition of slavery in the territories. The response was swift and cold. The first Congress tabled the petitions, literally pushed them aside. Freedom was deferred again. Meanwhile, Washington traveled the country as the living emblem of the new republic. Crowds shouted his name, children waved small flags, and orators praised the Constitution as the greatest achievement of man. But late at night, when the cheering faded, Washington wrote letters to close friends admitting his unease. He confessed he could see no justifiable reason for the continuation of slavery, yet could not imagine the republic surviving its immediate end. He was not alone in this contradiction. The founders had chained their own conscience to the fate of their economy. Benjamin Franklin, in his final years, grew restless with guilt. He became president of the Pennsylvania Society for Promoting the Abolition of Slavery. In 1790, he submitted a petition to Congress, urging them to confront this inconsistent and unjustifiable practice. Congress ignored him. He died months later, his last public act dismissed like a whisper in a hall full of deaf men. In the fields, Samuel listened to his mother, Dinah, tell stories of faraway revolutions. Haiti, whispers of uprising, rumors of freedom spreading through the Caribbean like wildfire. She said, "Maybe the Lord's wind will blow here next." Samuel nodded, his eyes fixed on the horizon. The Constitution had given America structure, but it had stolen its moral center. The enslaved could not read it, but they could feel its weight pressing upon their backs. As the 1790s dawned, America celebrated its new stability. Cities grew, trade flourished, politics matured. The founders congratulated themselves for their brilliance. But beneath the marble monuments and soaring speeches, there was rot, a contradiction eating away at the nation's heart. Liberty and slavery could not coexist forever. And though few knew it yet, the ground was already trembling beneath them. In the quiet of one evening, Samuel sat by a dying fire. He looked toward the big house, where the candlelight glowed softly through the windows. Inside, his master's family was reading from a Bible, their voices gentle and pious. Samuel whispered, "They say all men are made in God's image. Maybe one day he'll show me mine." The night wind carried his words through the dark, over the fields, across the rivers, towards a future not yet ready to listen.